So some of you know that when you've heard the story that when Lisa and I were were first dating, I was attending Quaker meeting in Ridgewood, and I had been attending for a while, and Lisa and I started dating. And as you know, Quaker meetings, most Quaker meetings, not all, but most Quaker meetings are what they call silent meeting. And so I would sit in the silent meeting, and it's about an hour long, and no one speaks. There's no minister per se. If people feel led to say something, they stand up, they say it, and then they sit down. And then possibly someone else might say something regarding that, or it's as the Spirit moves you. Sometimes you can go for a meeting and no one says anything, but it was very peaceful, and I enjoyed that. But Lisa and I started dating, and she would come to the Quaker meeting with me. And if you know my wife, sitting for a very long time is not something she's, without saying anything or doing something, isn't something she's able to do really. So she would come with me, and she would bring her needlepoint. And it's very, very, very quiet. And if you've ever heard someone doing needlepoint, you know that the needle gets pushed through and you hear a little. And so we'd be sitting in silent Quaker meeting, and all of a sudden you'd hear. But that's how she got through. And finally, she said to me, she said, you really should come to the Unitarian church with me in Ridgewood, where her mother and stepfather had been attending for many years. She said, we're just like Quakers, only we sing hymns. So I wound up going there, and that's how I wound up becoming a Unitarian Universalist. A few years after that, we moved from Ridgewood because of a fire in our house, and we moved. And we got busy with our home and busy with a business that we had. And I was going to Drew University to pursue my degree after having not done college for many, many years. And we gradually drifted away from participation in a congregation. And then we were told by a couple of our customers who became our friends at our cafe about another UU church that they attended nearby. And we went there, and we decided to, I went there first and decided to check it out. And the interim minister there, this was over at CUC. The interim minister there was a woman named Reverend Olivia Holmes. Perhaps you met Olivia when she was still around. And Olivia Holmes is actually a descendant of Oliver Wendell Holmes. But she was the interim minister there. And the Sunday morning I went, her sermon was about the transcendentalists who were in and around the area of Boston, Massachusetts during the mid-19th century. And they included people like William Ellery Channing and Ralph Waldo Emerson to some extent, and Henry David Thoreau, for a brief time Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Margaret Fuller, others who were part of that whole transcendentalist movement. But her sermon was about the transcendentalists that day and their connection to us as Unitarians. And I took that as a sign that she spoke on that, because I had been drawn to the work of the transcendentalists and their writings a few years earlier, or a couple of years earlier, when I was doing my work at Drew. And I did my honors thesis on the Unitarian minister and the founder of Brook Farm, which was a transcendentalist Unitarian, like a commune, I guess. It was an intentional community. His name was George Ripley. And so I had done my honors thesis on that. It was a utopian community. And in fact, if any of you suffer from insomnia, like I do, I will be happy to loan you my honors thesis. And I guarantee that you won't have a problem falling asleep at all. So I'll let you do that. But that was my introduction to the transcendentalist movement. And so naturally the question comes up for some people, perhaps, what is transcendentalism? Well, it has nothing to do with transcendental meditation. Let me put that to rest right away. Nothing, that came much, much later. Professor Jeff Wilson, who's a scholar of religion, he describes transcendentalism in this way. He says, the central tenet of transcendentalism was that human beings contained within themselves a mysterious internal principle that guided them towards religious truth, an intuitive capacity more profound and reliable than scriptures, ecclesiastical institutions, or tradition. This spiritual sixth sense pointed toward transcendental truth, such as the universal brotherhood and sisterhood of all people, the ability of the human individual to commune directly with the divine, and the presence of the sacred in the manifestations of the natural world. And he goes on to say, both the self-culture and social reform versions of transcendentalism have been bequeathed to modern Unitarian Universalism, part of the theological richness of our heritage. But we have also inherited the tension between them. The very freedom and individual affirmation of Unitarian Universalism can lead to spiritual navel gazing, while constantly channeling religious impulses into political activities, and can leave a person spiritually immature. Egotheism, remember that word, egotheism and activism as religion, two risks that Unitarian Universalists are vulnerable to, turn out to have a much older history than we might imagine. That's what he says. And I was caught by that word egotheism when I first came across it, but I came across it years ago. As it turns out, it was coined by Elizabeth Palmer Peabody, one of the most prominent Unitarians and transcendentalists of the time. As it turns out, today, May 16th, is her 217th birthday. So I'd like to introduce you to this remarkable person, one of our Unitarian forebears, because she had a lasting impact not only on our liberal tradition, but on the nation itself. And in fact, I would recommend, if you like history, if you like reading about American history or parts of American history, this is an excellent book. It's called The Peabody Sisters, written by Megan Marshall. It's quite a hefty tome, about 450 pages without the notes and index. But she talks about the Peabody sister. There is Elizabeth, Mary, and Sophia. And mostly in there, though, she talks about Elizabeth. Born in 1804, Elizabeth Peabody was born in Billerica and grew up in the heyday of Unitarianism influence in New England, primarily Massachusetts. And the name Palmer is, for her middle name, is her mother's maiden name. She was the eldest of 6 children, and one girl died in infancy, and the other, a brother, died while he was a medical student. So Elizabeth grew up with her 2 sisters, Mary and Sophia, and the youngest surviving child was her brother, Wellington. Her mother, Elizabeth Palmer, was a great influence on her children. And born in 1774, she grew up at a time in the wake of the Revolution. And like many of her age, women of her age, who had to work the farm and run the businesses while the husbands and sons and brothers were all off fighting, she became something of an independent thinker and a scholar in her own right. It was this independent way of thinking and the love of education that she passed on to Elizabeth and all of her children, and especially the daughters. Elizabeth helped give her daughters as good an education as most college men, and brought them up to support themselves irrespective of whether or not they married. Whether they chose to marry, actually, is what she said, because back then it was expected that you would marry. There was no 2 ways about it, but she always felt that they should make the choice if they want to or not. And this is probably because her husband, Nathaniel, was never quite able to decide what he should do for a career. He was sometimes a teacher along with his wife. He was a doctor. He was also a farmer, and he did a bunch of other things. And consequently, the family moved off and they never had a lot of money. And so even though Eliza would have liked that, he was a loving father who, like his wife, encouraged his daughters in their studies. So Elizabeth Peabody was a lifelong student. She learned 10 languages, including ancient Greek and Hebrew, and she cultivated friendships with Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Margaret Fuller, Bronson Alcott, all these famous transcendentalists and Unitarians, and others who advocated new ideas and human perfectibility. The turning point came when she first heard Ellery Channing, William Ellery Channing, preach in 1811 when she was only 7 years old. And she was enraptured by his sermons, even at that early age. And as a result of Elizabeth's exposure to the increasingly liberal theology of Channing and other ministers like him, who in the next decade would really start embracing a Unitarian position, Elizabeth often found herself, even as a young child, in heated theological arguments. But she refused to give in to the pressure of other children. There's a story about how children would tease her at school because of her theological ideas, and she would berate them and argue with the children over theology. And this is in grammar school. So because they would tell her with what their Calvinist parents taught them, which was that there are people who are saved and there are people who are not saved, and some people are destined to go to hell forever and others are going to heaven. If a child died without being baptized, he probably wasn't going to heaven. And she couldn't accept that. Others, even adults, tried to dissuade her, and including her parents, who were not Unitarians. They were dismayed by what they viewed as her heretical beliefs, and they tried all kinds of things to change her mind. Her aunt even tried to bribe her with a piano and music lessons if she would promise to read only Calvinist works and study them. And for a while, that was a temptation for her, but she resisted and just continued reading what she wanted to read. And as she read the writings of some of our Unitarian forebears in Europe, like Joseph Priestley, who is also, by the way, the discoverer of oxygen, she found that what I and many other students of our UU history find, our own thoughts and inclinations are affirmed and they're strengthened and they're clarified. Indeed, she says, it says, a quote from the book, all on her own, and by the age of 13, I don't know why I put that there, by the age of 13, Elizabeth had followed a good portion of the course of study that Channing had recommended for his graduate students in divinity at Harvard. So by 13 years old, this young woman had already done graduate work that was being taught to men at Harvard. And around this time, Elizabeth's parents made one last ditch effort to curb her increasingly liberal theology. They said she could choose for herself what to read if she would read only the Bible for an entire summer. All commentaries, particularly Unitarian ones, were banned. So she couldn't read the works, for example, of Faustus Socinus. If you've attended the history class we've been doing, Faustus Socinus, you know the name. He was an Italian Unitarian believer, not a Unitarian like us, but he denied the Trinity and the divinity of Christ. So she wasn't allowed to read any of those works at all. And so at 13, Elizabeth proceeded to read the New Testament through 30 times in 3 months, and each time in reference to a different point of doctrine that her parents and others were telling her she was wrong about. It didn't work. By the end of the summer, she was even more committed to her Unitarian beliefs. She was invited by friends that fall to go to Boston to stay with some friends who attended William Ellery Channing's church and to hear him preach in the pulpit. And at that church today is the UU congregation known as the Arlington Street Church. And so in addition to meeting with Channing in person, what was even more influential was sitting on Channing's women's gospel discussion group that he led. And despite her encouragement, or Channing's encouragement rather, the women either sat in silence or they struggled to articulate their thoughts. And this really bothered her, that a woman couldn't speak up and speak her mind. And she vowed to be different and to help other women to learn how to speak their minds. When she moved to Boston in her early 20s, she became something of Channing's, I guess, like a disciple. And she was also his scribe. She prepared a lot of his sermons for publication. And in fact, Channing would walk with her every Saturday morning and test out the sermon topics on her. That's how intelligent this woman was. She became very close to the Channing family, and she lived with them for a while. She would come home from school with their daughter, eat supper with them, and take dictation and hand copy manuscripts of Channing's until late in the evening. In the summer of 1828, she spent a month on vacation with the family, and she learned a lot from Channing. This was an important man and an important part of her life. And then she started hosting weekly conversations for women. Throughout the 1840s, she ran a bookstore in Boston that served as a salon of sorts for transcendentalists in the area and different reformers. And her store supplied many of the foreign language books that fed the transcendentalist movement. It was unusual for a woman to own a business like a bookstore. Brook Farm, the utopian community I mentioned earlier, was satirized in a book by Nathaniel Hawthorne called The Blithedale Romance. Perhaps some of you have read that book, The Blithedale Romance. And she hosted this group there, and he planned to write that book there. He actually wrote the notes for it there. Margaret Fuller, if you know her, a brilliant Unitarian ancestor of ours rather, hosted her conversations for women in the bookstore. She also published books, making her one of the first women publishers in America. She published Thoreau's essay, Civil Disobedience. She published 2 volumes of the Transcendentalist periodical, which I'll talk a little later, called The Dial. And she published books by Channing, Hawthorne, and others. For a time, she was the manager of this publication, The Dial. And it was never designed to be a commercial success. Nobody ever thought The Dial would really make any money. They just wanted to have a place to put out their thoughts and their ideas, the transcendentalists. And it was run really more on enthusiasm than it was on money. So in 1843, Elizabeth noted that the journal's income wasn't covering the cost of printing, and that subscriptions just totaled over 200, and it closed not long after that. But it remains important for us in our history as Unitarian Universalists. People like Emerson and Parker, Theodore Parker and Thoreau, they all contributed. And unlike most periodicals of the day, the Dial published translations of what they called ethnical scriptures, meaning sacred texts from others other than the Hebrew and Christian texts. So they included translations of texts or portions of them from Hindu scriptures, from Confucianism, from Taoism, and Buddhism. And in 1844, the magazine published Elizabeth Peabody's translation of a portion of the Lotus Sutra from the French, which is the Lotus Sutra, if you don't know, is a very important text in Buddhism. And it was the first translation of a Buddhist text into English, done by Elizabeth Palmer Peabody. But her real passion was for teaching. She opened her first school when she was a teenager, and she tried a variety of different kinds of experimental models. And she became involved at one time with Bronson Alcott's school, an innovative school called the Temple School for Children. Bronson Alcott, you may know, is the father of Louisa May Alcott and her sisters. And it only lasted 3 years, and he never paid her much. Their methods at the school of cultivating each student's innate gifts would become a hallmark of the progressive education in America for centuries. And in fact, Alcott named his daughter, the middle, there was Louisa May, and then there was Beth, uh, named her after Elizabeth Palmer Peabody. And they were friends, but eventually she left the school after, I guess they had a falling out. And he was so angry with her that he changed his daughter's name, wouldn't let her remain as Elizabeth. So Beth, in those books, her name was really changed to Sewall, Sewall. Strange name for a young lady. Elizabeth Peabody's teaching work came into sharp focus, though, in 1859, when she encountered the educational theories of a German reformer named Friedrich Froebel. Now, I don't know much about education as far as theories of education. I've never really studied it. Maybe you know the name, Friedrich Froebel. And he encouraged the spiritual and moral education of young children using organized play and physical exercise and activities in nature. And Peabody opened the first American language kindergarten in Boston in 1860. And she spent much of the next 20 years training kindergarten teachers and promoting his principles, Froebel's principles. Leslie Wilson, who is the curator of special collections at the Concord Library, writes that the kindergarten became a part of American life largely due to her exertions. She saw her educational work as part of a larger effort to reform human society, and it grew directly out of her Unitarian optimism about human goodness and Channing's advocacy of self-culture. I don't think any of us dispute the importance of kindergarten in our lives, and in the lives of the children that we've raised, perhaps, or our grandchildren or children we know, how important it is. And I have very fond memories of my year in kindergarten. I remember my teacher's name, Mrs. Hayes. She was a wonderfully warm, loving person, just the right kind of temperament you need to have to be a teacher in kindergarten. Because think about it, what are children doing at that point? They're learning to socialize. They're learning to get along with people that they don't go home with at night, or maybe not even live on the same block. They're learning to trust themselves to do things and learn things. So my year in kindergarten, I remember fondly. I imagine all of you remember yours as well. Maybe not so fondly, maybe more fondly. I don't know. I hope you had a good time in kindergarten. And this, at least in America, is a direct result of Elizabeth Palmer Peabody. In his book called American Transcendentalism, the author Philip Gura writes this, that she was famously absent-minded and, as some described her, desultory, dreamy, but insatiable in her love for knowledge and helping others to it. The idea of her being dreamy and desultory reminds me of the way some people talk about Unitarian Universalists today, sometimes. Our ideas aren't practical, they might say. We often hear that. It's the same kind of remark many of us heard while we were growing up in the 60s. You're just a bunch of hippies with your heads in the clouds. You're idealistic. The historian Bruce Ronda is critical of her, and he says that her energies had the air of noble but hopelessly lost causes. How many of you have ever had that said to you over the course of your life? It's a lost cause. You're too much of an idealist. You're too naive. Thankfully, Elizabeth Palmer Peabody didn't listen to any of that. And I disagree with Bruce Ronda. My friend, the Reverend James Ford, who was for many years the minister up at Providence, Rhode Island, the first parish in Providence, Rhode Island. He's also a Soto Zen priest. He writes this about her. He says, I think this emphasis on dreamy and distracted misses the real person. There is a yes and quality to this remarkable woman, which I think points to what we can be in our contemporary religion. I suggest a whole Elizabeth Palmer Peabody to be an exemplar of what it is we are at our best. Theodore Parker, he says, put it best when he described her as a woman of most astonishing powers, many-sidedness and largeness of soul, rare qualities of head and heart, a good analyst of character, a free spirit, kind, generous, noble. I should say that Elizabeth chose, as her mother gave that choice, not to marry. I think there were opportunities for her, but I don't think there was a man around who could measure up to her standards of what she needed in a partner. We have a long line of Unitarian and Universalist ancestors who have passed down to us our heritage of individual freedom of thought, and the search for truth and knowledge. And Elizabeth Peabody is one of them. Again, Leslie Perrin Wilson writes, a particular affinity for finding unity amidst all kinds of diversity, social, cultural, historical, aesthetic, and linguistic, and above all, a powerful drive to express her philosophical idealism in concrete ways. She was a practical transcendentalist, and she's a lesson to us, I believe, today. She's a model for us to be practical Unitarian Universalists without losing our idealism. May it be so.
If you enjoyed this video, please like us on YouTube, subscribe to our channel, and click on the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video.